Welcome to the Chief Strategy Officer Podcast. This podcast and Outthinker's executive peer network provide a platform for the architects of corporate success, chief strategy officers, to collaborate and share their unique experiences in tackling complex challenges, navigating disruptive technologies, and driving impactful growth. Today's guest is Ammar Maraqa, Chief Strategy Officer at Cisco, one of the world's most influential technology companies, pioneers in the world of balancing organic and inorganic innovation, studied for decades for their unique ability to integrate acquisitions. It's today powering the infrastructure behind our increasingly digital and AI-driven world. Ammar has a uniquely informative story to tell. He graduated from the same program I did at the University of Pennsylvania, the Management and Technology program. He worked at Bain, Dell, joined Cisco, then left to join Splunk, which, as strategy officer, he helped grow from 300 million ARR to over 5 billion ARR. Milking lessons from just that experience is worth multiple podcasts. But then he returns to Cisco with Cisco's acquisition of Splunk and is now leading strategy across the entire corporation. In this conversation, Ammar shares how Cisco's strategy organization is shaping the future of connectivity, cloud, and AI infrastructure, and how the company is reimagining innovation through an evolved version of its famous build, buy, partner, and incubate approach. We're going to explore how Cisco is positioning itself at the heart of the new AI infrastructure revolution. The company's focus on building AI-ready data centers and enabling digital resilience. What agentic AI means for the enterprise and the workforce. How Cisco fosters intrapreneurship through its internal incubator, Outshift. Cisco's view on the future of business in the AI era. And what makes a world-class strategy office thrive inside a global enterprise? Ladies and gentlemen, let's dive in with Ammar Maraqa. Ammar, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. I know that you have lots of other things that you could be doing, and we really appreciate you taking some time to share with us. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me. Excited for the conversation.
I wore my Penn shirt because I realized that you're M&T. I didn't know that.
I know. I was going to tell you, you and I are like OG M&T.
Yeah, exactly. When you can still get in.
That's right.
So we've already gone over your in the introduction, a little bit of your history. You joined Bain, then you joined Dell, then you joined Cisco, and then you joined Splunk, which then is acquired and brings you back to Cisco. Is that the general flow?
There's one Cisco in between there, but yes.
Oh, really?
So after Bain Business School, actually I joined Cisco for a while. Then I went to Dell, came back to Cisco. So this is actually my third time back at Cisco.
Oh, wow. That's great. Keep coming back. So you graduate from Penn undergrad. You go to Bain. That is a great place. Isn't that a great place to learn the fundamentals?
It's absolutely a great place to start your career if you're interested in business. It was such a great decision.
I have to say, I joined McKinsey after grad school.
Yeah.
And I'm so glad I did. However, I do find that people I meet who have been trained at Bain, you kind of like learn like actually the fundamentals of actually being a leader and kind of all the nuts and bolts of running a business and growing a business.
That's right. I think it was a great experience, a great start, both on the business side, but also to your point is sort of learning to sort of think about managing teams, thinking about building a capability, building an office, building a culture. It was actually a great formative experience for me. I really enjoyed it.
That's great. So then tell us about the second time, I guess, that you came back to Cisco from Dell. What motivated that?
Yeah. So when I joined Cisco, the first time I joined basically in the corporate development. So I was part of the M&A and corporate investment team. And I'd always been interested in technology and business. I mean, it's why you and I went to the same program, which was actually a mix of business and technology. That's always been something I'm very interested in. So the reason I left to go to Dell, I started in the strategy team, but I quickly actually wanted to get a more operational experience. So I ended up doing product management, leading the pricing organization. It was a really great experience. But actually coming back, the funny anecdote is sort of my old boss at Cisco at that time called me up and said, listen, we actually are starting a corporate strategy team, which Cisco hadn't had at that point. So they got to $40 billion of revenue. They never really had a central strategy team. They had the M&A team, which was, incredibly advanced, and it was kind of a best practice in a lot of ways on how to do M&A, but they had not created a strategy team. So he remembered that I came from a strategy background, and he said, hey, how about you come back and actually start this team.
Amazing.
And so for me, the challenge actually was to go back and start something new. I was sort of employee one, if you will, in a brand new capability, kind of building it in an established company. That really was the main reason wanting to go back. And it was a really great experience. And I was there for basically started the team and then grew it over time. And it's still going on right now, which was fun to build in a big company.
I didn't realize that was the beginning of the strategy team. So for those who end up staying on and listening to the chief strategy officer version of this podcast, I want to start there because then you've seen it from the full thing. Beginning. That's great. Fascinating. So let's just fast forward a little bit. Then you see Splunk as an opportunity, and obviously you had incredible success there. But what was it that you saw in the company or the opportunity that made you think Cisco's a great place to grow, but I'm going to leave Cisco and I'm going to join Splunk? What was it that motivated you to do that?
I really think of my career in sort of chunks of time and increments and really focus on what do I want to learn and sort of what muscles do I potentially want to exercise. And so I was really having a great time at Cisco. It was a wonderful building that team. What I really was trying to optimize for from a next experience is a very different type of company. Basically, most of my exposure outside of consulting has been large technology companies, Dell and Cisco, really large established companies. So what I wanted to do is do something very different. I wanted to go in a small company that was growing pretty quickly and really had a lot of scaling challenges. The business problems that they were dealing with were not the same business problems that I've seen both at Dell and at Cisco. And that's really what I was optimizing for. So I was waiting for or being opportunistic on companies that are still early in their journey, where I believe that the market is such, or they're participating in a market that really has a ton of headroom, where a lot of the fundamental strategy questions have really not been solved. And those questions revolve around how do you scale a company? How do you grow it, continue growing it? I had not really been exposed to those kinds of problems. That was really the fundamental reason why Splunk sort of fit the bill. It was about 1,000 people and it was about 300 million in revenue when I joined it. And it was already public, but it was still relative to Cisco and Dell, which were my sort of formative experiences. It was a much, much smaller company.
And for listeners like I was before we started preparing for this, who don't know what Splunk did or does, what was Splunk when you joined?
Yes. Splunk is this funny name, the company with a funny name.
Great name.
Splunk is basically a data platform that specializes in ingesting what's called machine data. So think about every digital system actually produces these logs that are notoriously unstructured. Every machine does its own format. And the reason why you're looking at data is because it's really incredibly insightful around the health of any one particular system. So if you have a system outage or if you have a security incident, one of the best places to go to understand what happened is really those log information. And so what Splunk basically enabled people to do was to actually get that data ingested very, very quickly without needing to spend time schematizing it, putting it in sort of rows and columns because the data is so messy, and allow you very, very quickly to understand, zero in on what happened at any one particular moment. So if you're doing an investigation, it's an incredibly great way to find basically a needle in the haystack.
Got it. And somehow you joined the company's 300 million ARR and you help it grow to 5 billion ARR. That's a major transformation. I imagine there was some business model transformation in that as well. Maybe could you briefly outline for us what the nature of that transformation was?
Yeah, I think you can imagine almost every aspect of the business actually transformed. But one of the reasons I liked Splunk and I joined it is, from just a secular demand perspective, data was exploding. Both IT operations, observability, and then security were all use cases that were just completely getting to be incredibly difficult problems to go solve.
So you have 5 or 6 big tailwinds.
That's exactly right. So that explains a lot of the product market fit in a lot of ways was sort of perfect time. And then the things that we did to try to transform is a couple of things. One is when Splunk started, actually, it was a classic on-premise, traditional perpetual software company. And we actually pivoted it to a SaaS, cloud-first company, both in terms of the technology that we develop it, but also we moved the business model to be 100% subscription software and SaaS. And so that was a massive, massive transformation that has P&L implications, and it has obviously process and culture and team and all of that. But we also went from a sort of single product platform company to much more of a multi-product use case focused company. So we actually took the platform component of the company and we made the really good decision upfront early on to not go sell a generic platform, but go after very specific buyers with very specific use cases. So we went after the IT operations, the next gen observability, and we went after the security analyst in the security operations center. And even though we were selling a platform, we were very crisp in going after very specific buyers with very specific use cases. And that just allowed us to create repeatable go-to-market motions and products that allowed us to go fulfill that demand. Plus the secular tailwinds in the business really drove the growth.
Yeah, so you can really pinpoint the needs that are urgent needs as opposed to kind of going to market with some things that are kind of important, so those that are not. What about just looking a little bit internally? Were there any major kind of organizational or cultural or incentives or structural things that you had to do? Because to support a $5 billion business requires a different kind of infrastructure or organizational infrastructure.
Yeah. And then you're asking the questions that I actually was dying to learn. The whole reason for me joining a company that was scaling that quickly, right? So a lot of really lessons learned. I think some of them are from a headcount and a talent perspective. I think what you realize is as the business grows, the type of talent you need, the type of experience changes quite a bit. And, to say it without sounding harsh, but your A players today may not be your A players tomorrow as the business grows, because the scale just outstrips people's experiences. And so you constantly need to look at refreshing your talent. You also need different levels of experience of people who have seen things at scale. When you're young and you have product market fit, you just need really smart people who want to work hard and do the right thing. But over time, you actually need a lot more discipline in these functions, and getting people who have seen it at scale makes a really, really huge difference. And then, we're a B2B software company. And so evolving the model to how do you sell SaaS? How do you think about renewals? All of these capabilities we needed to build, and sort of investing ahead of the curve and being able to get the right talent to drive that, I think was one of the biggest things we did. Then operationally, moving from a perpetual company to a subscription company pretty much touches every aspect of the business. So we needed to transform operationally, right? Going from selling perpetual to selling subscription, selling cloud, setting up a cloud operations team, a renewal sales team, pricing, et cetera. A lot of these things actually changed. And we were just lucky because as long as the demand was there, we could transform pretty quickly because the business was healthy and continued to grow. And that sort of gives you a lot of cover to do a lot of transformation.
And the one thing that you see often when companies like scale at that level, especially with like multiple products or multiple needs, which I think is something that, at least as my reading, Cisco has been good at maintaining, is maintaining that customer-centric focus instead of having different products sold to different people in the same enterprise, kind of looking at the customer solution. What did you have to do within Splunk to be able to sell and deliver at scale?
I think one of the biggest lessons I've always tell people earlier in their sort of journey of their company is be maniacally focused on the buyer and put a really, really high level of threshold around expanding from one buyer to the next, because that adds a whole layer of complexity to the way you run the business. And so one of the things we did is we had two buyers. We had an IT operations buyer, and then we had a security buyer. And even though the platform can go and solve lots of other use cases and all kinds of other functions, all the way from operations to supply chain to even marketing, because it's an analytical tool, we were so maniacally focused on our two buyers because we always felt like there was a lot of TAM for us to go and potentially go after before moving to a next buyer. And that discipline was really critical for us to be able to scale and drive things in sort of a repeatable way. And I would say if you pivot too quickly outside of your core buying centers, you end up, I think, diluting the focus of the company, especially when you're so constrained for resources.
Where do companies struggle to make those clear choices, right? So is it in product, or is it in channel? Is it in sales, marketing? Where do you find that it's critical to embed that discipline to say, we're sticking with these two buyers, even though it looks like maybe there's some low-hanging fruit with marketing?
Yeah. It's funny because the way I would answer it, maybe it's a cop-out, but to me, what was really critical is to have we used to call a steel thread all the way from product development to support and services, meaning you had to think about the product delivering a use case, and you have to think about that use case all the way customer back. Because if you deviate or try to serve different buyers across that value chain, you will ultimately fall on your face, especially when we move to a SaaS-based model where you're constantly getting feedback about the customer. And if you don't adopt, you won't renew, which means you won't grow. And if you deviate anywhere across that motion, it's very difficult to recover.
Yeah, the permutations of the implications just proliferate.
That's right.
So I'd love to talk more about that. However, let's move forward now. Cisco's acquisition of Splunk. It's one of the largest software deals not only for Cisco, but in history. What was the strategic rationale behind that?
Yeah, it's actually three distinct things. One is the product portfolio was incredibly complementary. Cisco existed in all the markets around security, around observability, but what we bring to the table really complemented the Cisco portfolio almost perfectly from a security perspective, from an observability perspective, and then the added benefit of a data platform that can actually also be used across all of Cisco's infrastructure products was something that was very attractive to sort of both companies. The second big thing is actually Cisco is on its own doing a transformation towards software and subscription. And so Splunk was just a great addition to that transformation. It added, $4 or $5 billion of subscription ARR, which allowed Cisco to just continue furthering its journey on its own sort of transformation around software and subscription. And then the other thing is from a Splunk perspective, even though we had great growth up to 5 billion, we were still subscale when you think about our presence outside the United States. We had 20,000 customers. Cisco has hundreds of thousands of customers. We had never really built a massive channel at scale. All of these things that Cisco has, was best in class at, being able to take the product that is Splunk and leverage the go-to-market engine that is Cisco was really a pretty attractive combination for both. These are the three things that sort of made the industrial logic sort of make sense.
Double clicking on that so we can visualize this a little bit for a non-technical person. What's an example of a problem that Cisco can now solve with Splunk that it couldn't before?
Yeah. If you think fundamentally what Cisco does, Cisco sells a ton of infrastructure. It sells networking, it sells servers, it sells security products, all of this infrastructure. With Splunk, you're able to basically enhance the visibility that you can get across what's happening in that infrastructure from a security and observability perspective in a way you've never been able to do before. One of the values of Splunk is we're so good at that heterogeneous data, the collection of that heterogeneous data, that we can sort of add value across the entire footprint of what Cisco sells a customer. And so from a customer value perspective, you now have a ton more visibility. You're able to really understand what's going on in your environment that allows you to understand the health of what's happening, but also it allows you to secure it in a much better way when you bring sort of all that data that's coming off of that infrastructure into an analytical tool like Splunk to give you this sort of assurance and security and observability. And we call this digital resilience at the end of the day.
Got it. Okay. What are the big needs that you see customers struggling with or needing support with now? I think you've talked about training infrastructure, enterprise clouds, network connectivity.
Yeah, so we recently went through an exercise where we were asking ourselves this question, which is sort of what are the major problems that we want to solve for customers? And that became we called it our One Cisco. And there are really three. The first one is we want to help customers build AI-ready data centers. The infrastructure in data centers is fundamentally getting altered with AI and what's happening with AI. We want to help customers across all segments be ready and build these data centers. So that's the first one. And if you put it in the context of AI, a lot of these data centers is where a lot of these sort of digital workers, the agentic world is in the data center, and we want to get people ready for that. The second big area, really, it's future-proofing your workplaces. What does that mean? It's the campus, as people go back to office, or it's really working wherever they work, the coffee shop, or it's on the road, and that has to be seamless. And then the third big piece that I mentioned before is really digital resilience. And the best way to describe it for me is if you're a CEO of a company, your systems go down, your e-commerce website goes down, you really only care about getting it up and running. You don't care whether it's a security incident that took it down or a system outage. At the end of the day, you need to be resilient because every minute you're down is costing you dollars, not only actual dollars, but also reputational damage potentially. So how do you keep your systems up and running from a security and observability perspective? And that's a lot of what Cisco is able to provide, partly through the Splunk acquisition, but also from some of the existing portfolio. So those are the three big problems we're trying to solve for customers. And sort of wrapping all of that is security. We want to make sure that and then we're trying to, infuse AI in our own products to make our customers just more productive.
Yeah. I want to go a little more deeper into that infrastructure layer of the AI stack. But before I go there, you mentioned agentic. And I think that when people who are listening think about agentic AI, they're thinking about that application layer, the interaction with the human, but your agents are doing other things. Maybe you just characterize for us what an agent does for Cisco.
Yeah, the way we think about it is fundamentally it's taking an actual worker and sort of giving them a virtual team of people that can do work on their behalf. I mean, at the end of the day, we do believe that in a lot of ways, a lot of this automation is going to have the human in the loop to begin with. And then over time, there's going to be more and more of these agents that are performing tasks independently. But at the end of the day, all of these things are going to require new infrastructure. Infrastructure meaning there's demand on the networks, which is good for us, but there's also need to make sure you understand the identity of these agents. You need to make sure that they can access things that they're supposed to access. How do you make sure that data doesn't exfiltrate? There's all of these security and infrastructure problems that could arise if you're not careful. But fundamentally, I think there's no denying that whether it's classic automation or whether it's agentic over time, these things are going to make every one of our workers a lot more productive, and it's going to allow you to do higher value added tasks. And that's something really, really exciting. We see it in our own products. So if you're call it a security analyst, your ability to summarize an incident should really now very easily be done with AI. Your ability to, through a natural language interface, be able to understand what's happened from a root cause perspective, that lowers the barrier of people actually, using those systems. There's all of these examples where AI is already helping people get more productive. We think that that's only going to increase over time, and that sophistication is going to continue to get better and better.
Mm-hmm. I heard the CEO of NVIDIA, he kind of laid it out is the stack is, what everyone talks about is the app layer. And then underneath that, you have the large language models. Then you have the infrastructure, and then you have the chips, and then you have energy at the bottom of the stack. And all of that is kind of being reconfigured. Cisco is operating right at the heart of that. And so you must have a view or hypotheses of where it's going. What do people get wrong when they think of how that stack is going to evolve?
Yeah, I'll start at the highest level. I think, as usual, with almost every transition, people are overestimating the near term and underestimating the long term impact. Meaning, there's a lot happening right now, but I think we're going to look back and realize how profound this moment really is. When you think about the infrastructure, maybe break it up in two different pieces. There's the training infrastructure. So these are these massive systems that are being built that allow you to actually train these models, these LLMs. And, in a lot of ways, that is, from a customer segment perspective, being concentrated in these hyperscalers and what's now being referred to as neoclouds, which are the new sort of cloud players that are actually building these massive GPU farms to be able to run training runs of these models. And that infrastructure it's super high throughput. It's incredibly expensive to do these training runs. Now there's inferencing, which is basically once the model is trained, you need to actually do all the things that you are trying to do with those models. And a lot of that is referred to as inferencing. And that's a lot of where the enterprises are going to deploy new infrastructure to take advantage of all of these models. And a lot of times, depending on who you ask, the inferencing infrastructure is going to be 10x, 100x the amount of infrastructure being spent on training, because there's only going to be a handful of models over time that I need trained, but almost everybody's going to need some level of inferencing. But this also is a relatively new set of infrastructure because it demands different type of latency. As you push it more and more to the edge, it's going to require new infrastructure. And then the thing I would add on top of it is when AI becomes physical, so this is the whole robotics and moving it down to factories and things like that, it's like a whole nother set of infrastructure that needs to get thought through that has fundamentally different latency and security. And so we're really at the beginning stages of what I would say is an entirely new sort of infrastructure revolution, which makes this job pretty interesting right now.
That's exciting. Yeah. Let's just talk a little bit about, Cisco has tons of business cases about how Cisco acquires, how it partners, when it builds. He has a history of being very thoughtful on those decisions. So I was wondering if you could just unpack for us, for those of us who aren't as familiar as you are with Cisco's historical and current kind of approach to the key decisions of building, buying, partnering. How do you guys think about that?
Yeah, and I would say I think Cisco did an amazing job through the 90s as essentially the internet was being built. And Cisco was at the forefront of really thinking of innovation in a very different way than a lot of other companies, where essentially we thought of the market around us and the startup ecosystem as an extension of our own R&D. And that was a very powerful concept because it allowed us to basically say, you can always be scanning what's around you and you won't have a monopoly of good ideas. And you should absolutely think about leveraging the balance sheet as a way to drive a faster time to market from an innovation perspective. And even though that's easy to say, I think what differentiated it for Cisco is it became part of the culture. So every general manager that owned a piece of technology, they were constantly thinking about, do I build it or do I buy it? It was sort of, it wasn't an unnatural act to think about M&A. It was just part of what you think about as you're thinking about driving better, faster innovation for your customers. And that, I think, persists to this day. So we think about innovation as there's a build aspect, and that's, all of the R&D that we spend. There's a buy aspect, which is M&A, and we do a lot of M&A. It's a pretty scaled machine. And then do we partner? And of course, we have a thriving ecosystem, and we think about partnering very much as a critical part of innovation. The other thing we've added over time is this idea of incubate, where we have a team that's also under actually the Chief Strategy Officer organization that's really focused on trying to think about research and developing products and early technologies in some of the areas that aren't squarely in the realm of our traditional engineering organization. And so we think about all of these levers together, build, buy, partner, incubate, as a way to think about, hey, how do we make sure we stay ahead of the game and think about leveraging the ecosystem as part of our own innovation engine.
Great. I wanted to learn more about your entrepreneurial efforts. I took this list of the 30 most transformative innovations of the last 30 years from a Wharton panel. And what I found is that 70% of those innovations were conceived of by employees inside established companies, not from entrepreneurs. Maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what you're doing to activate entrepreneurship, because that's an area that I'm very curious. I think is important for us all to embrace.
Yeah. And I would say internal disruptive innovation is one of the hardest problems in business.
Mm-hmm.
We think of it in a couple of ways. One is we try to stay very close to employees that have great ideas that even decide to leave Cisco and create their own startups. We actually want to invest in them. We want to stay close to them because they could be acquirers. And there's so many people that boomerang back into Cisco because they actually call us, want to be acquired by Cisco, even though they actually left and built technology that could be relevant for us. So maintaining those relationships is a really important part of the way we sort of view our jobs. But we also have this internal team we called Outshift that's actually building net new technology and experimenting with net new technology. And they have a very rigorous stage gate process for sort of what passes from one stage gate to the next. Can you demonstrate some, workable technology, prototypes? Are you solving a customer problem, et cetera? So we're attempting to do it that way as well, where we have a structured sort of graduating incubation process where you have an engineering team that's outside of the traditional product organization that is trying to work on these technologies. We're doing research in quantum. We're doing research in agentic AI. We actually recently created an open source project working with a bunch of other tech companies called Agency that we've given to the Linux Foundation. So we're doing research, but we're also trying to productize technologies in this group and trying to then graduate it, if you will, into sort of classic Cisco. And so it's a combination of, again, not losing track of what's happening outside of Cisco and building those relationships and seeing what's out there. But then also internally, we're trying to carve out a team or a set of teams that are working on some of these net new disruptive technologies. And what's really hard is just how do you make sure you get it to some scale and graduate it? And how do you maintain the funding? And there are all these classic challenges. But I think it's a combination of both what's happening from a ecosystem, but also what can you do internally to take advantage of the technology and the people and the ideas and get it to a place where you can demonstrate enough traction to be able to graduate it to the engineering group.
Have you found any success in using some of your skills in taking unstructured data and matching stuff and kind of taking API tag data and like using the technology to facilitate some of that ideation?
Probably less on the ideation side. What we've done, I would say, in Outshift is just very sort of methodically trying to go through this sort of filtering process and really applying kind of the classic incubation stage gates of, can you prove the technology? Can you prototype it? Can you really move through it? Because if you just treat time and funding as the most scarce resources, are you always working on the things that could be the most impactful for the company?
Great. I want to double click a little bit into the organization of the strategy office, because here's a unique opportunity for me to sit with someone who's seen Cisco, company of Cisco scale with no strategy office. You established some strategy office. You came back, the strategy office was a little bit different. And now, because of this kind of interconnected dynamic that we're all competing in now, there's like probably a new strategy office. What did you need to establish initially? And how is the strategy office today different than it was when you left?
Yeah, I mean, when I established it, I think the thing that we needed to sort of convince the company, if you will, is that we need a centralized strategy discipline. and that strategy is a discipline. And the way we did it, honestly, was a centralized but embedded model. So we sort of got people that understood Cisco, understood the technology, understood the markets, but had a strategy background. So worked at a consulting firm, or ideally worked at a consulting firm and did some strategy work inside of companies, and then built that slowly by essentially the hard work of being credible and working on things that are important to these GMs, and just initially building that sort of capability slowly but surely. And what I would say now, I think, is that team is sort of well established. It's mapped to each of the businesses and the products. But at the end of the day, I think the way I like to think about it is you're successful when it's a pull model versus a push model. And what I mean by that is if you're strategy police, meaning you're going to the GM and saying, I'm going to inspect your strategy and I want to make sure it's right, I don't think that's a good, successful model. The pull model is where people are coming to you because of your expertise, because you can bring something to the table. And to me, the sign of a successful strategy team, central strategy team, is there pull for that team versus you're constantly trying to push your way and getting credibility at that table. That's not a sustainable way to go do that. The other thing I would say is the combination of teams that make up at least the strategy office here are really, it's sort of an ideal set for me. What I mean by that is you have the strategy team, you have the M&A and investment team, which I think is a really important part of the inorganic part of the strategy. There is what I would call the business operations or a biz ops team. Here we call it the office of the CEO team. And think of that team as the team that does planning, the team that sets the agendas for the executive team, the QBRs, et cetera. And that's really important because you're writing the agenda, you're setting the stage for what's important, the metrics, the KPIs. It gives the strategy a lot of teeth. And then the last part is really the incubation. Having these components together is a really great way to do what we do, which is ultimately bring the disruption happening outside the company into the company. That's really what it's all about. And can you do it in a way where you're credible and where you're driving value add and you're peering ahead and seeing what could disrupt us and what could be an opportunity?
Yeah, it seems almost like your experience building businesses, you're doing that, but you're triggering internal demand, you're building capabilities, training people how to use you and keep coming to you. Let's get a little more tactical. What is a strategic concept that you found particularly valuable? Bain has introduced us to all kinds of things, profit pooling, for example, and you train people. You take people who don't have maybe a strong strategy background and you build them, you teach them the consulting toolkit. What's a strategic concept or principle that you found particularly important?
I'll give you one concept and maybe one principle. A concept that I go back to over and over and over is actually the simple prioritization framework of attractiveness versus ability to execute. And what I always see people falling into a trap is they do one or the other, or they don't think about the ability to execute as something that is just as important as the attractiveness of the opportunity. And, the ability to execute is a measure of go-to-market motion. It's a measure of technology. It's a measure of all of these things. And in companies, people underestimate how hard it is to potentially execute on something new. And so to me, I always go back to that as sort of a 2x2 or a framework. That from a concept perspective, one thing I always tell my teams is, strategy to me, the simplest definition of strategy is it's how you allocate your resources. Fundamentally, that to me is the simplest definition of what are the strategic decisions that we're trying to drive. And the reason I like to talk about how you allocate your resources is because fundamentally, that's how you know whether you're making an impact or not and whether the strategy is actionable. Because coming up with an answer is sort of step one, but fundamentally, have you allocated resources to go execute? And so the actionability of a decision landing is what I always try to harp on my teams and my peers on, which is then that at least you're taking a shot at figuring out whether that strategy is right or not. And those two things for me have always proven to be good kind of cut through things to really understand whether what you're working on is not just interesting, exciting, but also actionable at the end of the day, because that's what we're here for.
I'm going to listen to that response a few times. There's so much there. How can people continue to connect with you or learn from you? Do you publish? Are you active at all on LinkedIn or anything like that?
Yep, I'm active on LinkedIn, and I'm happy to continue the conversation. Looking forward to it.
Well, Ammar, thank you so much for taking the time to unpack for us. And I will encourage people to listen to this a few times because you left lots of Easter eggs here that will easily be missed if people don't slow down and listen. Thank you so much for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Thank you to Ammar for taking us inside Cisco's strategic mindset, from its vision for AI-enabled infrastructure to its disciplined approach to innovation and execution. Thanks to you, our listeners, for joining us on the Chief Strategy Officer podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, please rate, comment, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. To learn more about how CSOs use Outthinker to accelerate their success, visit outthinker.com.